I happen to be here in Belfast, Maine, with Nicole Luttrell, a filmmaker and, well, really kind of an author of women's rights in birthing, something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah. Is it? Are you more political than a filmmaker?
I don't see how I can separate the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they go hand in hand. I think that my choice of subject matter can't help but be political, and that's birth.
Yeah.
And midwives and home
how
birth
is
in
birthing
particular.
political?
Because it's been the site of incredible oppression for women for many years and continues to be.
Yeah. Oppression.
Well, if you look at history, for up until fairly recently in our history, women did not have the choice to not have babies. So they were, because of the bounds of marriage and religion and all of that, women didn't have a choice to give birth or not. They had to. So that's one major field of oppression. And of course, the first wave of feminism, here I'm getting some practice because I'm going to be teaching Intro to Women's Studies next semester, was really, in some ways, it was actually about freedom from pain in childbirth. So that was the focus of one of the first waves. But of course, access to birth control came later. But that's just some of the history around around birth. Yeah, and of course, women being raped and incested and things like that, and then having to have babies from that. So so there's this whole spectrum of tension and conflict and choice and around birth, around birth, which is something that we all have to do. We're all born, so yeah. It's big.
It's big.
Yeah, it's really big.
I've admired your focus on the subject in the Facebook pages and looked at some of your videos. Mm-hmm. It's quite graphic and it's quite real, which is an astonishing thing in this day and age of Hollywood, where everything looks beautiful.
Yeah.
There's a certain beauty to home birthing that is. Well, what do you think?
Well, yeah. I think that women. When you talk about when I start talking about the spectrum, and feminism. When we talk about choice, for me, it's very much the right to have the kind of birth experience that a woman wants, the right to, a healthy, safe, empowered birth with the practitioner of her choice in the setting of her choice, home, hospital, birth center, is just as much of a right as the choice to have a child or not. And those words are borrowed from Ina May Gaskin, who is one of the supreme priestesses of birth. Anyway, it's kind of, when we talk about politics, we're talking about that. We're talking about that women, it's a woman's right to have a choice around these things. And when we talk about beauty, I think that a woman is the most beautiful. I see women as the most beautiful when they're giving birth. Absolutely. And when another human being is born, there's just an absolute, profound, exquisite power and sacredness to that nothing can match, quite frankly. Nothing. So I don't mean to be saying at all that all women should be giving birth, and that's the only way to be, a fully realized woman. I only say that there is great potential there. There is another way of looking at birth as something empowering and strong and beautiful and liberating in some ways.
Yeah. Are women ready to grasp that?
I think that some women are, and I think increasingly more women are. When you talk about me posting videos on Facebook and I have a blog, that's where women are getting their information now. And it's simply a transference from the original circles and networks that women have always had around supporting each other for major life events like birth. Women in let's say we can reference Martha Moore Ballard, a famous 18th century midwife. There's a book written about her called The Midwife's Tale, and it really focuses on these women's circles and networks, and they were circles of commerce, so women traded goods, and they were circles of comfort, and they were there for each other when a child was born, when someone in the family died. And this has just evolved and transferred over, I think, in a very interesting and ever-proliferating way onto the on the internet. So the internet has become a site of incredible info share and community and support and education and advocacy for women.
For everybody,
but in particular, the normal or natural birth movement has really just found such a space to thrive on the internet in these communities.
Because of the familiarity of seeing other women giving birth, it gives comfort to those who are going that way.
Definitely, but it's about access. It's about that in our culture we don't see birth. We just don't see it as much as, let's say, in earlier times, in Martha Moore Ballard's time, where birth was just a daily. It's not that babies are being born every day necessarily in that small town in Maine, but people were familiar. They were acculturated to birth, and birth. When birth became medicalized, it stopped going out of view, and then of course, being very attractive to Hollywood, got really twisted and contorted and dramatized, and that became so many people's image of birth. Birth as crisis, birth as emergency, birth as drama, birth as something that has to happen in a hospital with a doctor, and it's urgent.
As a commodity, too.
And as a commodity, of course, we can't not talk about birth and politics and, economics. Absolutely. Economics.
Yeah.
So, so with the internet, what I'm talking about with access is that, women, first of all, most people have computers, and people go on computers at, all times of the day, at all hours of the day. And so women have been connecting and finding content around normal natural birth online, where they may not be able to find that in their own community because there's a hospital with, a 30 to 50% C-section rate that's not disclosing those figures, or they don't have midwives in their town that they can go and they can get that information from. So they're going online and they're finding out for themselves what their choices are. And they're seeing birth. They're seeing birth in films, in photographs, on blogs.
It's kind of a larger transformation than birth itself.
I think so, absolutely. I think that, like we were saying, birth is big. Everybody is born. Everybody is born of a woman. And, there's just more and more information coming out about how we are born matters. It absolutely matters, not just for in that moment, but for the kind of human being that we're going to become. It's related to the field of epigenetics as well, like what happens to people's brains when they're born and how they're born. So
it's a huge topic.
It's huge, and it's we could get into so many facets of around women's voices and women's authority, and that it's not only important, obviously, for the baby about how they are born, but it's important for the mother. That kind of experience that she has can inform her, can very much influence what kind of parent she becomes. And then later on, I mean, myself, I had a really, really fast, powerful birth with my son. And it was less than 7 hours, start to finish. I had no early labor. And half the time I was in denial. I didn't actually believe that it was happening, because he wasn't due for over 3 weeks from when he actually was born, which was December 27th, coming up in a week. And all the while, when my midwife was over and she checked me and said, "You're 7 centimeters," and I said, "No way, there's just no way," because part of it was concern. My son was coming early, but part of it was, this isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. And I'd read the stories. I'd read many stories where it's like, I was teetering on the line of life and death, and I felt like I was going to be ripped apart, and that wasn't my experience of my birth. So, but the point of it was, there were times when I had a real, you sort of get out of your, you go into what I call your body mind, and you're not thinking with your rational mind anymore. You're in this body mind. And, but I remember thinking, I'm doing this. And, several years later, when I encountered some other life transitions and some challenges, I would think about my birth experience as I lay awake at night, worrying about these other things, and just knowing that I did that, and I can do this next thing. I can do this. And so the implications for women and their empowerment around having a positive, empowering birth extend far beyond the birth itself. And so you can look at the individual woman, you can look at the family, you can look at society, and we could talk about deference to authority. That's a huge one. I'll bet you one that you're interested in. Is that, we give away our power so much in so many areas of our existence. And, the people, it's been my experience that the people that are choosing home birth are really taking responsibility for that choice. And they've done the research. They know what they want. And they know they want to be free of institutional influences. And they feel empowered in their own authority. They trust their midwives, but working with a midwife can be very different than working with a medical provider, in that the midwife is very focused on informed consent, informed choice.
But the medical profession doesn't offer. Hold on a second.
Oh, okay. Gotta change positions. Is this okay?
I'm too twisted. Yeah, it's better.
Okay. Do you want me to sit up too, or is this all right?
Oh, no, you're fine.
Okay.
Where were we? I know what I was...
Informed choice, informed consent.
Informed choice, yes.
So we shouldn't say that all medical providers don't offer that, but it's been my experience, from my own experience. I started my pregnancy in a hospital setting with a certified nurse midwife, that, there's a lot of, the devil's in the details. There's a lot of fine, the small print that you don't see and aren't necessarily going to be told about in those pivotal moments. The risks of a cesarean section, that cesarean sections have now officially been linked with our increased maternal mortality rate in this country. So we have a 33% cesarean section in this section rate in this country, and we're ranked, I believe, 51st in the world of developed nations around maternal mortality. We have some of the shittiest rankings and outcomes, yet we spend the most money. We spend the most money in the world on healthcare, and a lot of our healthcare is spent on maternity care. And we have some of the worst outcomes. So choice around childbirth is really about reclaiming authority. And for a lot of people, being at home is about the only place that you can do that.
Well, in a lot of situations, urban situations, it's not convenient or it's not possible. Or
for what? To
but
do
maybe
home birth?
that's what you're talking about. Choice is overcoming the impossibility of it and going forth and doing it.
Well, as I will be helping to illustrate with this new public education campaign that I'm working on called I'm a Midwife, it will evidence that there are midwives in every setting. You know, there are midwives working in all different kinds of communities, from the rural, very rural, outlying areas to the urban. And so there are midwives everywhere. And so there are choices. The problem has been that a lot of women don't know about these choices. That's one of the problems. And so the internet and the normal natural birth movement is really addressing that in a very profound way. So women are discovering that they do have choices. And that's really, really important. The other inhibitor around choice is the politics between the midwifery community and the medical community, and that legally midwifery, some forms of midwifery are not legal in some states, so it's a question of access. In Maine, home birth midwifery is considered illegal. It's considered not the practice of medicine, so it's basically off the radar here. So anybody could be a midwife here. I could be a midwife. You could be a midwife. And it's basically out of the reach of regulation. There's some regulation around medication. And
there is no regulation
except around medications. The
midwives are not licensed.
They're not.
They're acknowledged as wise women.
By some, yes, and by others, just kind of accepted that they're there,
Taking the business away from the hospitals.
Well, it's an interesting consideration. In Maine, home birth, about 1 to maybe 2%, the numbers fluctuate, choose home birth per year. But in an area like where I live here in Belfast, that number is probably much higher. It's probably more like 15, 20%. Those are soft figures. But there's a culture here around home birth. We have the Belfast Co-op. We have the Green Store. We've got a lot of, aging hippies and new back to the landers that are, that have a value set that is accepting and open to the idea of home birth. It's talked about.
A support system.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We have 2 home birth midwifery practices in downtown Belfast. Whoa. So that tells you something, So, yeah, the midwives here in this town are pretty busy. And the hospital, from what I understand, has a pretty astronomical C-section rate. And
Belfast Hospital.
Yes, Waldo County General has a C-section rate. I've heard figures 40 to 50%.
Wow.
Which is scary.
Scary.
It's scary, and the implications of that.
Just to go off the to a different note.
Yeah.
You women that you have videotaped giving birth, have they been transformed by the concept of film or video recording their, and the word is not performance, but the word is their transformation of giving birth to a child, but it also transforms the woman a little bit. I mean, I saw one of your films and there was a woman in the front row with her husband and a child crawling around the floor, and she was watching herself on the screen with 20, 30 people behind her. It has some effect. Have you any thoughts about
It's
that?
a great question, and I actually wrote about it in my master's project manuscript, about the hidden benefits to the participants of this project. I go right away to the woman who I filmed in the film At Home in Northeast Harbor, who spoke to me extensively after that film was released about how much it did for her about her body image, and seeing how powerful and beautiful she was giving birth. She was really able to see and appreciate her beauty in a way that felt healing and transformative for her. So I have not heard any complaints thus far from the women I have filmed about seeing themselves
or
on screen.
realizations.
You know,
yeah.
It seems like most women get a lot from seeing themselves, you know, from seeing that. And
so it's kind of a support system too.
I'd like to think, you know, like I said, that it's a benefit for the women themselves and women that participate, not only to have a record of this pivotal life event for them in their families, but to see themselves in their power being supported in a way that is so incredibly meaningful and transforming. Yes, transforming. And so it's been really good to know that the women themselves, the women that are participating, are really getting something from this. And these women are choosing to be a part of this, like Melinda spoke about at the At Home at Waldo screening, that she wants to be, it's kind of a passive activism. It's a way for her to, you know, because she cares about all of this so much, it's a way for her to participate in a movement, to participate in helping to educate other people about this choice, that it is available, that home birth, midwifery care is available, and that it can be really an amazing thing.
Are you available for anybody who's looking for a filmmaker or a videographer for birth?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, I'm available to film births. My intention is to continue adding to my At Home in Maine series, so I am always interested in speaking with families that would like to participate in this project. I also am available for hire if people do not want to participate. If you know, being on the big screen is not your thing, and you just want to document this event, then yes, I also do that as a service.
Yeah. Do you have any funny stories about birthing videos or anything like that? Things that you've seen that you shouldn't have, or you might have been, you know, privy to, or?
Well, I don't know. I'd have to think about that, but funny. It's amazing how much laughter I've seen at birth, which flies in the face of what, you know, you'll see on TV. Laughter and birth just do not go hand in hand in Hollywood. However, I have filmed, gosh, I don't know, 3 or 4 births where there was outright hilarity. In fact, in the film At Home in Winthrop, which I highly recommend seeing, there is a sequence in that film where I call it the M&M scene, and there was some M&Ms there that the midwives were eating, and one of the midwives proposed, you know, well, let's all, you know, pop it in our mouths, you know, let's throw it up in the air and catch it in our mouths. And there are incredible footage of the mother contracting and laughing, and it comes as close to orgasmic birth as, you know, outside of the actual film Orgasmic Birth. This mother was in ecstasy, was laughing and contracting and eating M&Ms, and it was priceless. It was
Is there
priceless.
a film called Orgasmic Birth?
There is a film called.
Did you do that?
No, I did not.
But,
I did not do that.
That's as close as you've come to.
That's as close as I've come to that. But it's a really interesting concept, the idea of orgasmic birth. How many women actually have orgasms during birth, I think, is few. But the idea of opening up sort of these semantical spaces when we describe birth, instead of painful or torturous or intense or, you know, uncomfortable, that it could actually be something to be enjoyed, you know, to be experienced, is really interesting. You know, that we've got some new language to describe birth.
Yeah, if you can get over your fears and the tightness of fear. In automobiles, the people get really hurt if they don't get killed are the people who anticipate and clench their bodies.
Yes.
And then they get hurt. But the people who are unaware, or should we say inebriated, they can oftentimes walk away from the most amazing wrecks.
Well, that's an interesting analogy. Certainly the tightness part that you could totally bring into birth. That Ina May Gaskin, who I cited earlier, has this thing she calls sphincter law. And basically, in terms of birth, if you're tight because of fear, usually, tension, you're not comfortable in your environment or with your provider. And, of course, women giving birth we're mammals. We're mammals. We have a mammalian brain that kicks in when we're giving birth. And, so if we're tight and, I've heard many midwives say at births, open vagina, open mouth, open vagina, to loosen up, that's what helps it happen, but it can take different strategies, different techniques to have that happen. But being at home in your own space, where you can walk around naked, you can make as much noise as you want, like I did. You can labor in the bathroom, in your living room, in the kitchen. You can go outside and go for a walk. You can be in all these different positions. That's half the battle, is feeling comfortable in your space.
Yeah. What kind of sounds? I'm a great believer in tonal healing and stuff like that. Deep vibrational healings. And
Talk about catharsis. The sounds that I was making when I was giving birth to my son, when I was going through transition, that 10 centimeter mark, were sounds that I could not believe that I was making, and that you hear other women say the same thing. I sounded like some kind of lion goddess. I don't know how else to say it, but I was roaring. I was absolutely roaring from my yoni on up through my upper chakra. I was just roaring it through. And
the roadway of chakras.
That's what a baby is born from. It was so incredibly powerful. Maybe it was going this way, but I want to say it was coming this way.
Probably going both ways.
It was probably going both ways, yes. But these sounds, I've come to know now after filming 10 or 11 births, I've come to recognize those sounds when a woman is really about to give birth. I've come to know, to be able to distinguish the sounds of early labor to the sounds of like that baby's head is starting to come through the vaginal opening. And it's a sound like no other. It's a sound like no other. It's an incredible sound.
Okay, well, if I asked you to try it, I couldn't do it.
I couldn't replicate it.
It's in your films. It's in your videos.
Exactly. Watch my movies.
Yeah.
But it is a deep, deep sound. It is a vibration. It is cathartic. And, this one woman who I was referencing earlier, who derives so much about her body image, part of it was she made a lot of noise in this particular birth, and she talks in the film. I have pieces in the film where she talks about how she felt afraid to make sounds in the hospital, and I don't know if she was actually shushed by somebody. She might have been, but it is not uncommon. I've heard story after story after story of women that are told to be quiet, to keep it down in the hospital.
It sounds like a subject of a great video about the freedom of vocalizing. Just that subject alone must be extreme.
Well, and there's another example of oppression. So
oppression.
We talk about women being tied down in the 40s and 50s, probably the time that you were born. Women were tied down. They were euthanized in a way, where they were knocked out, or they didn't even remember their
episiotomy.
Episiotomies, yeah, it's still happening. It's still happening.
Yeah.
And
in home birth, episiotomies in home birth.
No.
Not at all.
No, I mean I couldn't say not at all, but in my experience in Maine, no, that does not happen. Episiotomy is when it's a cut that is made on the vaginal opening to widen the vagina, to widen the entry point for the baby. and it's a medical procedure, which is why midwives in general do not do that. And like I said, it was it was introduced with the idea that it would help the baby get out easier or swifter. But who benefited from that? Did the mother benefit from that? What often happened, my mother, for example, is one case in point, had a very deep cut episiotomy where they cut all the way back to, her sphincter. And she's never been right since. She's never been healed totally since. There was a lot of pain and incontinence issues. And this is a common story for many, many, many American women. And it occurs less as a practice, but it still happens. It still happens. And again, the idea that that makes the healing easier is bullshit, essentially. A natural tear finds its connector points much easier than a straight cut like that. And midwives, of course, are trained to suture tears. I have filmed many births where there's been no tearing whatsoever.
All of your births, many births.
Not all of them, but many of them, where there's been no tearing because the woman wasn't on a clock to get the baby out, wasn't, being coached in this, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but wasn't being coached, to get to push the baby out.
Antiseptic.
Well, that's not the word I'm looking for, but I'll think of it probably after you turn off the camera. But this idea that you've got all these people around you going push, and you're doing this breathing and forcing that baby out essentially. And and of course, when we look at forceps and vacuum extraction, there's going to be some damage as a result of that, not only to the mother but to the baby. But yeah, so I've witnessed births where there's been no tearing, where rather than get that baby out, it's in fact, midwives and their assistants coaching the mother to take their time to let the perineum stretch. And that's the space in between the vagina and the anus, and to really let that stretch out. And the vagina, I just read something the other day, can stretch 200 times its capacity or its normal size. And so women can do this. In fact, a woman who's been part of my project, whose birth I did not film because I was in Niagara Falls filming 40 midwives, just gave birth at home. A 40-year-old woman just gave birth at home to her first child, a 10-pound, 7-ounce baby with no tearing.
40-year-olds.
A 40-year-old.
What's the oldest woman that you've...
The oldest woman that I filmed is Melinda, who was 42 with her first biological child. Yeah, but you hear stories all the time about 42, 43, 45, 47... and that's another total misnomer, which I talked about that night at that screening, was, that once you hit 35, you're risky, you're a geriatric uterus, and so you need to be heavily managed. And
by doctors, you mean?
By medical providers, you need medical care. And that's just not true for everybody. For the vast majority of people, that's probably not true.
Yeah, well, Nicole, this is all very interesting, and I know that we're going to do a series of these interviews because it's just, there's so many questions. But for the first one, maybe is there anything that you'd want to throw out that's really important for people to think about, even if you've already said it, about their birthing a child?
That you have choices. You have choices around your birth. And that there is information and education. There's information out there to educate yourself with. That you have choices. You can have a home birth. You can have midwifery care. You can have a birth center birth. And that, there's lots of information out there that can help educate you about these choices. I think that's the most important thing, in that you can give birth. You can give birth yourself. That, for myself anyway, and for a lot of the women that I know and have participated in this project, and other women I've talked to, having a strong, empowered birth experience can really activate you in other ways. It can be the start of your political life. It can activate you to care more about your community and get involved in meaningful ways in your community, to really start paying attention to some of the other areas of your life, like the kind of foods you're eating, like your child's education, like the products that you're buying, where they're coming from, like our political officers, really starting to do your research on that. I think that birth can really lay the groundwork and the foundation, the value set for getting more activated in other areas of your life. But when we're talking about epigenetics, we're talking about, again, like going through something, a really big challenge like that, and then, realizing that you can do things. You have this authority. You can do things in other areas of your life. But it's the same thing for birth, epigenetics, baby mind, learning about baby mother mind. And so being born is work for the baby too. It's work to go down that vaginal canal. It's work. And it's compressing the brain and squeezing the brain and stimulating the brain. It has a purpose, vaginal birth. And so to be born with that stress and to some extent, it's stress. It's positive stress, but it's stress into this loving environment where you're brought to your mother's breast, and there's love and support and quiet and low lights and peace, and you recognize all the voices, and to have had that experience after that stressful experience means that you are safe. There's programming that happens in that moment that you are safe, that you can experience challenge and stress, but you're okay. And just think about how the world could be different if more people felt safe. And I think that potential really lies in, in home birth, in normal birth, in, safe, empowered birth. So, it's good.
It's a beginning.
It's all of our beginnings. It would be great if that kind of birth were more of our beginnings. We're talking about specialized.
Oh, yes.
How birth has become so specialized that family physicians are moving more and more out of the picture, and
right.
OBs are taking over. And we're talking about induction. We're actually talking about the cascade of interventions that can result from induction. And induction is when labor is augmented to increase or to hasten. And so unlike normal, natural, physiological labor, where there's a natural ebb and flow of contractions, where a woman can have really, really intense contractions and will, she knows that there's probably going to be a rest period after that intense contraction. When a woman is induced, her it's just wave after wave after wave, which is unnatural. And so a lot of women can't handle that. Who could handle that? And so that will often induction will cause fetal distress or purported fetal distress. And then we see on the heart monitor, that the baby is in distress. And so then next thing you know, she's getting a C-section. So the risks of induction, the risks of C-section are not often disclosed to women. And my point about that is that one intervention often leads to a cascade of interventions. And it's really hard to not have some form of intervention in a medical environment. just because the way it's set up. So, yeah, that's really the state of mainstream maternity care right now, is a highly interventive approach, a highly interventive model to birth. And there are, of course, exceptions to that in various institutions where midwives are there. There's probably going to be less of that where there are certified nurse midwives, but we're still looking at a very highly interventive, not serving mother or baby model of birth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People do survive.
People do survive, but at what cost?
At what cost, exactly.
At what cost? The
what gain?
figurative, or other costs of that kind of birth experience. When you compare the price of a home birth, which in these parts maximum is probably going to be $3,000, to a hospital birth, which uncomplicated hospital birth is probably going to be around 8 to 10 in these parts. You compare that with interventions in a C-section where you're looking at $20,000, $30,000. So there are definite financial consequences to hospital birth, and the fact that insurance doesn't often cover home birth or home birth midwifery care is something that really needs to change. Really needs to change. And we talk about choice and access, and coming out from oppression. That's part of that too, as well. Because unfortunately, home birth is only mostly accessed right now by privileged, educated, middle-class women. And this is a choice, when we talk about oppression, that this choice needs to be available to all women, not just the privileged women.
So we need a federal program?
Well, there actually is a federal program right now to make certified professional midwives able to accept Medicare, and that's on the federal level.
It's a beginning.
It is a beginning, and it's meant to be a federal legislation, and the midwifery community, the professional midwifery community, is definitely building support. They have a coalition, but building support amongst legislators, in DC. And probably for that to really happen, you have to be licensed. To see At Home in Maine, which is an online film series about home birth and midwifery care, and not just for Mainers, and not just about home birth, it's about normal, natural, woman-centered, family-centered birth. To see these films, you can go to mainehomebirth.wordpress.com. That's mainehomebirth.wordpress.com.
Cool.